Good morning. My name is Jennifer Rawlings. I am the Tribal Affairs Director of the Center for Indigenous Peoples' Rights. We are about to begin our day 3 of conference. Thank you all so much for being here. Um, our, our topic this morning is about the protection of our ancestral languages. So can we please have our panelists come and join us? So we have with us today Kasike Jorge Estevez from the Higuayagua Taino, and we have Keshonn Red Spirit Jackson of the Wabbaquasset Nipmuc. Thank you both for being here this morning and joining us for this very important topic. Yeah, turn them on. So, Jorge, I understand that you have a presentation for us.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, please, go right ahead, and then we'll go to Keshonn after.
So I'm going to have to read it off my phone because that's a little far for me. Okay, so Miyari Abatoma, Dairile Kasike Atuno para que con Catecuas, Lanka y Guayabasaka, Lantaino Carilucono, Dawarito Waria Kairi, Lanki Sikeya, Waria Kain Kayeke Haibon, Turale Abadaikutama Mayaha, Omabu. And thank you, Tony at Taino Palermo for having me and for everyone who put this together. So I realize that a lot of people here don't know me, so I'm going to just talk a little bit about myself first, and if you can just go to the next slide, please. So I arrived in this country in 1965. So I arrived in this country from 1965 as a result of a civil war that was taking place in the Dominican Republic at the time. And I came to live in a predominantly white neighborhood. And that's one of the things that caused me to identify so strongly with my indigeneity, because oftentimes, like, the teachers didn't know where I came from. So they would ask me if I was Indio, or I got everything. But, and the bottom picture of here that you see here, that was actually something that happened to me in about the 3rd grade, where a teacher asked me if I was from Guatemala because I resembled the little Mayan statue that she had. And when I replied to her that I was actually Indio, but from the Dominican Republic, she actually went to the back of the classroom and picked out an encyclopedia, and she showed me that there were no Indians in the Dominican Republic. And what you see in the back here, and the other one is my grandmother's passport, where in the Dominican Republic, they use this color scheme to avoid calling people black. So they'll have things like Indian color, or dark Indian, or light Indian, but it has no reference to actual Indian. And that was my early childhood, just always fighting for my identity and so forth. Can you go to the next slide, please? Next one. Okay, so for those that don't know anything about the Taino Arawak language, it is the most widespread native language in South America, probably of all of the Americas. It is the Tamaipurian, which is the largest branch. And this is where I'm gonna have to use my phone now, because I don't see a lot of these things that you see up there. So, the Arawak people actually began arriving in the Caribbean about 6,000 years ago. So a lot of linguists, and archaeologists believe that possibly there was a lot of influence from North America and South America. But due to recent genetic studies, we know now that all the migrations that came into the Caribbean were predominantly from South America. So we know that the languages that were spoken in the Caribbean were, in fact, Arawak. And this is the language that Columbus encountered when he entered the Caribbean, when he first came to the Caribbean. Next slide, please. And this is the latest migration routes that we have, the most up-to-date ones that show exactly how the Arawak people came in basically two migrations. One happened 6,000 years ago. These are called the Archaics. And then about 2,500 years ago, another migration came, and that's what evolved into what we call Taino today. Next slide. So what you see here is I worked at the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian. I was there for 25 years, and the culmination of all that work that we put into that ended up with this exhibit that we had. We launched it in 2019, along with the Smithsonian Latino Center. And I actually worked on all three facilities. You see on the top picture is the museum in Washington, D.C. The one on the bottom is the one in New York City, where I was basically stationed at. And we also have the Cultural Resource Center, which is in Suitland, Maryland. That's where we house the entire collection. So next slide. For that particular exhibit, I was able to go to the Caribbean, all over the Caribbean, on the government's time, which is never a bad thing. And basically looking out for what we call markers of indigeneity. And depending on where you go, you find different markers, but the way it was explained to me, if you only find one marker, then there's probably not as much indigenous survival or retention. But in most of the places, you find 6, 7, 8 markers on them. So these markers that you see here, they're like genetic continuity, oral traditions, identity, agricultural practices, material culture, customs, spiritual traditions, and of course, language. Next slide. So for about 35 years, I have been collecting Taino words. Everywhere that I found the Taino word, I would make a note of it and what the word possibly meant. And I ended up with a list of about 3,200 words. Next slide. When the Taino movement began back in the late 1980s, everybody was interested in language. That's probably one of the most important aspects of our indigeneity. And of course, the Taino language basically disappeared. Different people use different methods to go about it. But the problems that we encountered were these. For example, of all the Taino words that are recorded, almost all of them are nouns, right? So you have names like Caimito, Leren, Yuca, Batata, Mapuey, Warawao, Maco, Coqui, Bibihawa, all nouns, and these are the names of flora and fauna. And then place names like Aguana, Maguana, Mayani, Boriquen, Cuba, Quisqueya, again, all nouns. So it is basically impossible to create a language or revitalize the language using just nouns, right? So that meant that we would either have to borrow someone else's language, which is appropriation, or borrow words from different languages, which is basically appropriating too, but not in the same level, right? So that's what basically I started doing. I started borrowing different words from other languages, related languages. The other problem that we found was that all the Taino words that are recorded are all spelled using Spanish orthography of the time. But the problem with that is that Spanish orthography was not standardized until 1750, right? So if a person was from Castilla, they would spell a Taino word in one way. But if they were from Mencía, they would spell it in another. And this is one of the problems that you see when you look at Taino words as they appear in the historical chronicles and things to that nature. So like words like, for example, Guanabana, which is a Spanish way of saying it, should be Guanabana in proper Arawak. Next slide, please. Okay. So, I'm sorry, can you go to the next slide? So to solve this problem, what we did was that I created a just one way of spelling all the Taino words. So what we did was that we took all the Gua words and turned them into Wa. All the hard C's became K's, all the soft C became S's. And basically it's just to spell all the words in one way, but also all the borrowed words, we spell them in this way too. And then suddenly all the words started matching. And then we found more cognates in this manner. Next slide. And then of course there was the problem of words that didn't exist in the old days. So like a word like refrigerator, we had to find ways of creating a word for refrigerator. So in our case, what we did was like ice box, you know, so there's a word for box and a word for ice. So we put them together and created a word like that. So, and then the next slide, please. I'm sorry. And then after that, what we did was borrowing, like I said, the verbs and other nouns from related languages. The languages that we chose were the ones that were closest to Taino in our opinion. I did work with several linguists, like Alexander Eichenfeld, who's probably one of the top linguists, Arawak linguists, and also Conrad Ripka and a few others. So we borrowed words from the Locono, Wayunaiki, Anu, Tariana, Wapishana, Garifuna, Baniwa, Teresi, Akawayo, which is actually a Kalina language, a Carib language. And of course, we kept all the Taino words that were recorded. And one of the concepts that I learned, because I am not a linguist and I don't pretend to be a linguist, but I already spoke basically 3 languages. I speak Spanish, English, and a little Portuguese. And I learned this concept of nested identity, which is where people that come together from different ethnic groups speaking different languages, in time, they develop a new language, right? And this is exactly how I learned how to speak the Spanish that I speak. Because I lived when I came to this country, I lived in a building where my stepfather was Mexican. Our next door neighbors were from Ecuador. And then my mother's cousin was married to an Argentine woman. So there was all these different Latino people living in the building. And I picked up all their Spanish. So there's some times that I could like when I'm upset, and I can curse in all those Spanish languages. I go from Mexican to Dominican like this, you know. So I understood the concept of nested identity. So what I did was using all my dictionaries and imagining myself in a place where I would have to use a nested identity and creating a new language. And I asked myself, how would I borrow words? What would be the words that I would borrow? Because if Locono has a certain word that I need, but so does Wayu, what would make me use Wayu instead of Locono? And most likely it'll be the ones that's easiest for me to pronounce. So that's how I went about it. And that's how Higuayagua came to me. So we could skip over the next few slides. Go to the next one after that. So that's what we call an ajiaco, a soup of language soup. So the next slide. So so to teach my people in Higuayagua, one of our members developed, started working with Quizlet and creating different, what they call those flashcards, you know, online flashcards. And I put together a language team. Next slide, please. I put together a language team consisting of Jessie Hurani Marrero. She was the one who helped me with the language. Kalichi Lamar, Raji Cotea Ruiz, Alexander Adams, Yalti Quiñones, Susan Holt Rodriguez, Melissa K. Marin, Elba Edie Spears, Luis Reynoso, and Nelson Camariz Zayas. Each one of these people are very talented with language themselves, and they're the ones who helped me to put this all together and begin to teach it. And next slide. So Alexander created an app, which is something that we hope to use more, that we'll be using more. And he created an app that translates from Higuayagua to English or vice versa. And now what we're doing is creating a database of Arawak languages so that when you type in a word, let's say in English or Spanish, all of the words will be translated into all the different Arawak languages. That way you can see the connection. Because the idea is that, in my belief, is that the ancient Arawak language, what was spoken when the Columbus came, that language is gone. And I don't believe that there was actually one main language. I think there were different dialects. When you look at South America, let's say if you look at from Cuba to Puerto Rico, that's about 200 kilometers, 200,000 kilometers. And if you place that landmass in South America, you'll see that between those points, the variety of languages is tremendous, especially amongst the Arawak languages. So I find it hard to believe that the Taino people only had one dialect. It's possible, but I wasn't there. I can't really know. So, but I know that by using different verbs from and nouns from different languages, we can get to what the root of the Taino words that we do have are. And next slide. And this language app, we also have it now on our phones so that we can, so when people are practicing the language, they can use it right on their phones as well. Next language. Next slide. And that is, so we have a page on Facebook where people go to practice. And what we have in the page is that one of our rules is that you can't speak in Spanish or English. Whatever you put in there has to be in the language, and the responses have to be in the language. And that's forcing our people to really practice. So now we have about 200 people that are really actively learning it and speaking it. And some actually are pretty fluent in it already. And next slide. So as a result of borrowing from these different languages, we found many more cognates between these related languages. So we found that a lot of words that we thought were actually Arawak are actually, in fact, Carib. One project that I'm involved with now with Conrad Ripka, that's yet to start, is he and along with another linguist have started mapping out all the words that we have in the Caribbean today that we believe to be Taino, which are in fact Carib. And it's a lot of words. This work has never been done before. One of the things that I found when it comes to studying Taino language is that no linguist has ever worked on Taino language, only on Taino language. It's never happened. When you look at people like Julian Granberry, these are like the top people who have written books on Taino language. All of them are either archaeologists or anthropologists. But an actual linguist, only Douglas Taylor took a look at the language. When I asked Conrad Ripka, why was that? He said, because nobody's interested in working on an extinct language, you know, and that's why Taino has been stagnant for such a long time, and why we've made so many mistakes in the past, believing that some words are Taino without even questioning them. But the Spanish did us a disservice. They left us a lot of clues, but because of the way they spelled the words, a lot of the words are just, you know, really incomprehensible sometimes. So some linguists tell me that when they look at it, what they see is more Spanish in these words that we believe to be Taino than actual indigenous languages. And next slide. So so now we're working with linguists, you know, trying to map out what the actual ancient language was like. We know that it's a limited project, but Conrad is involved with a 60 person group of linguists, all looking at the Arawak language and trying to map out a Proto-Arawak language, which is really exciting. So I think that that's going to yield a lot of results in the future. The next slide. So this is a picture of myself and my grandnephew. And the reason why I have this here, he's heavily involved in language, and he's part of Higuayagua, of course. And he was involved in school. He was involved in some Native American project, and of course he chose Taino. And when he typed in Taino in his computer, a picture of me came out, and he told the teacher, "You see, this is my uncle, and you see, he's the Kasike of Higuayagua, blah, blah, blah." And that's how far we've come from when I was a child, and I was questioned, and I was told by teachers, "Look, you're not, because look, it says it right here," to this. So it's really an exciting time, and I think that for the future, we're now going to have better information coming out, and there's a lot of bright things happening for the Taino people. And of course, our language effort is not the only one. There are other Taino groups working on language. I applaud them all, because what I believe is that 30 something years ago, there was no Taino language. We had words, but no actual language. So if today we have 5 efforts and it leads to 5 languages, that's better for the Taino people. So basically we're all working on Arawak anyway, so it's all good. So I applaud everybody's work. Next slide. And of course, over here, these are some Taino descendants in Cuba. Next one, and Puerto Rico. Next one, Dominican Republic. And what we're doing now is taking our language to these places as well. So with that, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. And in listening to your words, I definitely see a lot of parallel between your struggles and your experiences that are seen over here in these lands with the Algonquin language. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Keshonn Jackson, Chief Red Spirit of the Wabbaquasset Nipmuc.
Well, I'm not really a language person, so this is kind of like it was kind of like not something like when Two Hawks first reached out to me, I was wondering, I was like, maybe I should get one of the language experts to explain this, but I'm like, it's kind of out of my comfort zone. It's something different for me, and I never took a language class, and we offer language classes every Sunday, and it's been for the past like I don't know, at least 10 years. So Nipmunks can go online, and we have like at one time they were doing it in Grafton, like and then every other Sunday they would do it online with a Zoom meeting, and then Tuesdays or something like that. But I know it's been offered for a while. And David Tall Pine White was the guy who kind of started the classes about 10 years ago. And since then, he had passed, and now you have Tashana Carter and Raina Smith. They're kind of the main instructors on the language classes. But you can go online. It's nipmuclanguage.org and register for the classes. They're free classes, and it's available to anybody in the Nipmuc community or Nipmuc members. And I think the classes are every Sunday and some Tuesdays. But back to me, like getting involved in this. I was wondering, I was like, language is very important. You know what I mean? Like we're oral people, so it told a lot of our histories, and this is the way we communicated with each other. So my grandparents and grandfathers and grandmothers and aunts and uncles always communicated and told the stories through our language. So for me to learn this is very important. You know what I'm saying? So by Ray calling me up and me doing a little bit more research, and like, I mean, I have a colonizer mindset, you know what I'm saying? Where, oh, I know English. I don't need to know our language or the language, you know what I mean? That's old. Nobody cares about that. But it's very important. It tells our history. So for me to like learn that language and get involved. So the next class, I mean, I talked to Kim yesterday. She's another Nipmuc, you know what I mean, who was on a panel yesterday, and we talked about it. And I said, she said, so you're going to go into the next language class? I said, yeah, I'm definitely going to sign up for the next language class because I need to know my language. I need to know, like, you know what I mean? It's much more than just the business aspects about it and land and stuff like that. It's our history. And I want to know what my grandparents and grandfathers and grandmothers talked about. So that's why the protecting our language is important to me. And I'm definitely going to join the next class. I mean, some of the other things, like I said, like Dave was one of the guys who basically started the school. So I definitely want to always pay homage to Dave Tallpine White because he's the one who started the Nipmuc language course, and he received like some grants, and they're still doing it now. So I mean, what I wanted to do is say, if anybody out there sees this and wants to help us out, because we also need help. still with those grants, if you want to, you can reach out to NIDC, Nipmuc Indian Development Corporation, to Shauna Carter. She's the head language instructor, P.O. Box 60127, Worcester, Massachusetts. Or you can reach out to her on Facebook. It's Tashana Carter, Tashanna, Carter, Carter. And I reach out to her and try to work something out or try to help us guys out, because we definitely do need to keep that language amongst our people. I mean, I don't, like I said, I didn't really come prepared for this, but I'm learning as we go on. So it's kind of the end of, yeah.
Yes, we will take a question. Yes, please.
Couple questions. My question had to do with the app. Is that downloadable, or is that only access to your, like, folks in your tribe as far as the reconstructive?
Outside of the group, because the interest has been so big that you know, I tried to keep it just within Higuayagua, but it was just, when I started this, it was just for Higuayagua. Didn't have any like delusions of grandeur, and I still don't, because I didn't really create a language. What I did was put words together. Language is what people speak amongst themselves, and that's what turns into language, you know. But yeah, some people started teaching people outside of Higuayagua. And once if they get a dictionary and I know that they're interested, then, you know, I have made exceptions so people can download the app and join the page where it's in, definitely.
All right. Another question is this. In my experience dealing with a bunch of other chiefs from different areas, and particularly like the way that you were just referring to Cuba and the distance between Puerto Rico and geography, also found through speaking to other chiefs who have their own kind of reconstructive efforts, that some of the words, like you were saying, there's Garifuna, Kanago, Lokono words, but there's also a blending based on my speaking to some folks from other territories, like, for example, Muskogee Creek folks. Like, they say that down in the South, there's a blending of a lot of the languages. And through the slave trade, not quote the imagined just aspects of the transatlantic slave trade, but the North, Central, and South American slave trade, there was such a movement of folks from up here to the Caribbean, and from the Caribbean up here. So when you were referring to some of the language sets and some of the language that didn't really make sense, wanted to ask, have you guys ever considered any of those other related Southern American languages that might not be that far, like, for example, from Florida, some of the Muskogee, some of the Creek, so, or even some Algonquin language, because of the trafficking of you know, human trafficking of Algonquin speaking tribal members into the Caribbean and into, like, you know, pretty much everywhere to the rest of the world. So that was my question. Have you ever run into kind of any conjugation or phonetic structure that may not match kind of indigenous Caribbean, but that may tie into other indigenous languages?
Definitely, Carib languages have made their way into a lot of Taino. And if there's Algonquin or anything like that, I haven't found it myself, but I don't doubt it at all. It's very possible. I'm strictly focused on Arawak because, you know, ultimately what I want to do is I want to understand what my ancestors were doing, you know. So they spoke specifically Arawak, so that's why I keep it there. But it's possible that they had some influences from other places. I mean, people who trade in Tainos, they trade, are always going to trade, languages always exist. And that's why you find a lot of our words, you know, spread throughout Central America and other places. And, you know, like we have a word in the Dominican Republic, which is calumete, you know, which
Calumete or cayumete?
Calumete, right? So, or calimete. And that for us is a straw, right? But it also looks a lot like a pipe, you know, and over here you have the word calumet, you know, so you find similar things like that, you know.
There's also the dance, like the war dance, you know. So like this is my point. It's like I feel like I'm learning now so much more that, especially through colonization and first contact peoples, we kind of traded a lot in terms of we became each other because we were in this human trafficking kind of situation. So I see a lot of the ties, and sometimes it's beyond words. Sometimes I don't have the words, but I'll make a connection that I don't know how I made it, but it's in there. And it's just really interesting. I'd like to be possible to join your language group if possible. And thank you.
Thank you for those questions. And, in this conversation, I'm reminded that, I myself I'm a lifelong Wampanoag Pokanoket language learner. I began learning from my great uncle Three Bears, who has now passed. He didn't have access to Wampanoag or Pokanoket, but he did have access to the Nipmuc language, which he learned from being a member of the Algonquin Indian Council and learning from an elder Spotted Eagle, who's also now passed. But one thing that, I always struggle with is living in a place where so many of the place names are in the Algonquin language, Massachusetts, Connecticut. I can go on. And I just wanted to ask, Chief Red Spirit about, his feelings about the language erasure, the extent to which, we lost the language for, so many years and so many decades, but still having these places around us carry the memory of the places that we named.
I don't-
Well, so you are from, let's talk about.
Wabbaquasset. So Wabbaquasset means map making place or place where the or cattails, where the cattails grow, place where the cattails grow. I mean, and there's a lot of places like Chibungagungamok, like it's Chagagaga, man Chagagaga, Chabungagungamok. It's Lake Webster Lake or Lake Chibungagungamok. And that means you fish on your side, I fish on my side, nobody fishes in the middle, and then has to miss it. It's another Nipmuc band. It's a place where the little rocks or where the little rocks are or something like that. And actually has to miss it. They have a new tribal symbol, and it has the cattails in it and the little rocks and Nipmuc, we're Nipit, we're freshwater people. So a lot of, the good thing about the Nipmucs is we still do practice the language, you know what I mean? But there's some people like me and others that are younger that kind of, that colonizer mindset where we don't think that it's needed, but it is needed because that was our history. That's our history is an oral history. We didn't write down stuff like the colonizers, you know what I mean? So, and some of the old elders, talking to them and they still say them words and stuff like that. And me, I don't even understand half of that stuff what they're saying because I feel like I didn't need the language. But actually talking to Two Hawks and this whole panel thing had got me like realizing that I do need the language. And I went and seen a movie with Killers of the Flower Moon. Yeah, I went and seen that movie on Friday with the Osage tribe, and they all spoke their language, and that was like something, you know what I mean? And a lot of the tribes out west like keep their language, and that's how they're able to tell them stories. And we take things from them because they have that history. And because we were like first contact tribes, we lost a lot of that. But the Nipmucs do a good job of trying to keep the language afloat. And there's a lot of people who are still involved. And like I said, we have classes and like Three Bears was teaching Nipmuc language. Like our language is actually like a part of us still. Yeah.
And the way you were just describing the language and how these place names describe the elements around us of the earth. And, it shows so much of the culture of what was important to us. It was, the natural world around us. Thank you for that. I think we have a question. Yes. Yes, you. Mr.
Yeah,
Andy Reid.
I'm language handicapped, so I'm a lawyer, so I work working in Indigenous people's law. Language has a very important role, and it deals with identity, and the one thing I've noticed from the outside, I'm speaking as an outsider, is because I have to use language as a tool in establishing the status of my of the people I work with. And so language is key. And one thing I noticed in looking at it is that the first laws that the Spanish passed when Columbus came over here was laws to destroy the language. They took the eldest son of the chief of the Taino people. This is a law, and they required that that eldest son be taken and put with the priest there, the Catholic priest. And the priest taught him two things. One was Christianity to destroy the spirit, and then the other thing that they taught them was Spanish to destroy the identity. And those were the two things. And then they would take that son, the most important descendant of the chief, and they would put that son back in with his people to try to destroy those two things. And I've been working with various Native communities for a long time, and the one thing I noticed is the destruction of the language everywhere I go. And right now I work with I'm out in the West, and I work mostly with the Lakota people. And even with the Western peoples, that language is destroyed. We're speaking the colonizer language right now, whether it's Spanish, French, or English, and that colonizes the mind and destroys the identity. And we had some people, Maori people, come over from New Zealand once, and they did a presentation, and they started talking about their words, and the words are like this, they're super long. Hawaiians, same way. And the thing I noticed in the language, and again, I'm speaking from the outside, is that the language carried the whole history and the culture of the people that were speaking it. It said that there was this thing that occurred over here, and that it has this characteristic, and it's all contained in the words, and it made me realize how limited the words in English are. That they don't contain that. There's a specialized word for everything, particularly geographic locations and things like that in their history. And then I noticed for the First Nations people up in Canada, they have oral histories and so forth that contain their culture. So they would have a totem pole that's just like a language, and that totem pole would tell their history. And so as a lawyer, what we started doing is trying to bring in that into the courtroom to say this is their law, this is their traditions and their customs and so forth are contained in that, but it's also contained in their language. And I'm being a bit long-winded, but I'm trying to express that from an outsider, what I recognize is the importance of language. For the Lakota people, they have language immersion courses now that they have for their children. And when they conduct the big thing out in my part of the world is basketball. So they have these Indian basketball tournaments. But then they also, at the same time, they'll have a language tournament where the kids will come in and they'll compete in their language. And so that's part of the rewards for the language. But there's this very important effort of decolonization, which is done by reclaiming the language and the identity. And so I also see language now. I don't believe that there's an extinct language. I think language is organic and living. And so all these, I don't know if you're familiar with the book called Mexico Profundo by Basilio, who talks about the survival of indigenous peoples in the languages of Mexico, and go through that. I work with the Garifuna, and we have the same thing where we're trying to reclaim that. But a lot of it is the mixed and the melding of languages. But that mixed languages, Garifuna language is mixed, Garinagu language is a mixed language, but it still establishes their indigenous identity. So the final thing I wanted to mention on this is I also work with the Maroon people, and they brought over their African languages. And one thing they want, and so they're having me work with them to help establish legally their indigeneity, their recognition as indigenous peoples, but not indigenous peoples of the Americas, but indigenous peoples of Africa. And so one of the ways we're trying to do this is to show the survival of their African languages and for the Garifuna people. So I'm going back to this concept of identity and the importance of language in preserving the identity of Native people. And I was hoping that you could maybe comment some on that.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. That really brings us well into, the act of language reclamation as, exerting our sovereignty and self-determination.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I believe that it's impossible to decolonize by using, the colonial language. One of the things that when working on language, what I wanted to do was to be able to pray in an indigenous language, like my ancestors did, just to try to look at the world the way they saw it and not through English or Spanish. But because I speak English and Spanish, I look at things in two different ways. Language has a lot to do with how you see the world. So the more I work with Hiwatahia, the more I see an indigenous way of looking at things, and it's very different the way you express yourself, the way you treat others, and it's all a part of the way the language goes, So that's all I got to say about it. And what I did want to comment on one thing about with the Spanish, on this one thing that I'm working on right now, and which is reconstructing Ramon Pane, which is one of the chroniclers. I was reading that Bartolomé de las Casas, who was a priest, he wrote that the Spanish only learned to say three things, basically from his perspective, which was, bring me the girl, where's the gold, and I'm hungry. Those were the words that they learned in Taino. Everything else didn't matter to them. So like even in like Ramon Pane, who's credited with writing down all our spiritual traditions, chronicling that, there's a lot of words that he uses in there that are actually not indigenous, are actually Catalan. And it's only when you get into really working with the language that you start finding them. And not only just working with the Arawak, but also like understanding Catalan, which is the language that he spoke. And then how his version of everything that he wrote, which was in one language, and then it gets translated into Spanish and Italian. With each translation, you use more and more of the indigeneity. To what you have now, this time it's a fabrication. It's a lot missing from it. So you have to go back to Arawak to really understand what was being said, or was trying to, what my ancestors were trying to convey to him at that time period.
So yeah, so he was talking about prayer. So one of the first things I know that you do learn in that language course is prayer. You learn is a prayer. So we say it at every powwow or every gathering. So that's one of the things they do teach you. That's like one of the first things you learn in the language course is how they have a prayer. And I mean, I've heard it a million times and I couldn't even recite it because, like I said, I've always said, oh, I know English. You know what I mean? I don't need to know that language, but it is important. And I remember like a while ago, one of my elders told me, he said, you speak your enemy's language. You know what I mean? And I kind of was like, what is this guy talking about? But I mean, it took me a while to understand what he was saying, but he told me, he said, you speak your enemy's language. Yeah.
I remember the first word that I learned was how to say thank you. And I think that speaks a lot to the culture in that, you give thanks for and show gratitude for, everything that you have around us. I see we have some more questions from the audience.
Miyari usakasakabo da irile adahiabo. Greetings, everybody. My name is Dr. Darlene Flores. I am a member of Higuayagua. I am Taino from Borinquen. I just wanted to comment on a few things regarding language. First and foremost, being that I am from the Caribbean, even the Spanish explaining directions, how to get somewhere was always like, you go up to the side of the road where you see the big mango tree, and at the mango tree, you take a left, and there's going to be a guy with one eye, and the one-eye guy right there will tell you how to get to the store, and the store is on the top of the hill. And those type of directions in Spanish, I'm like, oh my God. So when I started learning Hiwatahia, and I started seeing how the language kind of emerged into this explanation of geography, I was like, wow, it kind of made sense to me that the people in the Caribbean would actually speak Spanish in broken, what do they say, Creole, gibberish, or patois, whatever they call it from the Caribbean. I said, to me, that was easy to understand. When you see somebody, if they had one leg, out of love, that's One Leg Willie. That's his name. If somebody was a fat person, excuse my language, they'd be like, hey, skinny man, and that was a way of endearment. And so those words explaining places or peoples or what you see was easy to come to me. And then Hiwatahia was easy for me because it kind of explained place names instead of, having names like Maria. It was person who talks too much, or, you know, the one leg Willie. And it was out of, you know, endearment. It wasn't, you know, discriminating or any ways. It didn't have anything negative about that. And me being a mother of 3 children, trying to teach my children the language, to me, I brought it back in how my grandmother would teach me things, you know, with my hands. She taught me, you know, different things, songs with my hands. She taught me how to get rhythm with different hand clapping games and stuff like this. And I taught, you know, my children the games that my grandmother would teach me. And then I said, wait a minute, let's change it now and put it into Hiwataia. And it was easy for them, you know, and then that turned into, let's turn it to, you know, the favorite songs that we learned, the Incy Bincy Spider song, let's turn it into Hiwataia. And then they were able to sing that song. So it was easy to teach the children when you bring it into games and songs and movement and rhythm and stuff like that. And that to me was nice. Then being here in the East Coast, in the land of the Eastern Woodland people, I would know who actually spoke the language and who didn't. And those people, when I started to speak to them in my language, they kind of caught up, and I would be in certain places and they would say good morning to me in Hiwataia. And that to me was so loving and important, as accepting as, wow, you know, this person is now speaking to me in my ancient language, in my language that my, you know, my ancestors spoke. And whether we didn't have a word for refrigerator, now we use, you know, icebox or something like that. I love that. And the fact that we are not hoarding the medicine or hoarding the language, and we are, you know, we're on our second dictionary that anyone can purchase. You know, anyone can purchase the second edition of the dictionary, and it takes a lot of hard work. The other thing that I wanted to say was I wanted to comment on the stories, you know, some of our creation stories. I'd read the creation stories in English or even in Spanish, or even try to read it in Italian. And it comes like, okay, whatever, you know, that's our creation story. But as I started learning the language, and the creation stories would have a name, say Makotaori Guayababa, or, you know, Matanino, you know, it was just a place to me. I was like, oh yeah, that's the name. It's hard to sound out. But now when I knew what that actually meant, the land without fathers, or that's a negation, or that's this, it kind of made sense to me. And I was like, oh my goodness, now that creation story means a little bit more to me, because that small word actually makes sense, you know. And talking and being able to explain our creation stories and now have a deeper meaning behind, or just learning the personalities of our actual ancestors, you know, when they talk about our creation stories and they say, yeah, we came from this cave and we came from this other cave. And when you actually, the name of the cave means a place of no importance, the people of no importance. That to me was hysterical, because this is my ancestors speaking to a colonizer, telling them a creation story. And they're basically saying, you don't need to know about these other people. You just need to know about me, you know. And that was funny to me, because that's our personality. That's the personality of our people, you know, in the 1400s, you know, and we're hearing about this, you know. When it comes to the prayer, when I started translating some of our prayers in the language, and I would literally, you know, be, you know, in a group of women and be in the women's circle, and I would do the prayer in the language, you know, I'm just trying to say the language or make sure I'm reading it correctly. And then I look up and everyone's bawling and crying, and, you know, and they're having this emotional, you know, moment. And I'm like, wow, that's what language does. That's what language does. It connects us to who we are as Indigenous people, and it allows us to create unity and community. And I love that. Thank you, Kasike. Arikomabu.
Thank you so much for that. How are we doing for time? Gotcha.
Yeah, real quick. Okay. So I wanted, because you spoke of the way that you took the language and started to adapt it for the Hiwataia and replace the C's with the K's and these different things, and understanding that the C's came from, quote, Spanish, which is actually some part in majority, not just regular Spanish, Catalan or whatever. But what I've noticed is over the years in the, quote, Neo-Taino kind of world, what's happened is that, and especially this applies to us, Boricua, particularly, and pretty much anybody diasporically that's being raised or living in the United States or any one of these kind of Romance languages places. It becomes a debate between our people that says, this is how you spell this, or this is how you spell that, or this is not how you spell. And what I wanted to make the remark about is that, again, it's all third party reference through another language that is not our language. So it isn't correct or incorrect to say that it should be spelled this way, because it's just based on a cultural mindset that we're approaching, looking at our ancestral mindset, which is completely different and sometimes adverse to the way that we look at right now. So just like you were saying, with a colonizer mindset, we're either coming with a Spanish dominant colonizer mindset or a quote English dominant colonizer mindset to look at the language and then debate over who's correct, which just leads to a lot of division. So I just thought about that. And one other thing is that, so over the last couple of years, I'm in the process of writing a book. The book is reconstructive, and it's also integrating some of the spiritual aspects of practice. And one of the things that I learned from another known figure, good friend of mine, who's going to be helping me to do some forward to this, is Mazat Sin. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with him, but Mazat Sin is kind of one of the world's foremost experts on the Tonalamat. Tonalamat being the calendar of the record of the passing of the days of the sun, which is what people call the Mayan calendar, the dooms, that seal. But what he explained to me is that their history says that 13 years before 1492, 1479, they called a conference in Mexico. They asked all of the cultures to bring their knowledge, and they codified their knowledge into this thing called the Tonalamat, which is a star map, a calendar. It has kind of codified medicine wheels of all of the cultures that came, which had to do with Caribbean culture, had to do with North American indigenous cultures. So, I mean, though we didn't have the diction and writing phonetically, it's all codified into there. And I just thought that was something that I should say, just because of the fact that we are all reconstructing. But sometimes and I'm finding this is that codified in some of the other languages and medicine wheels, there's a lot of this correlation that goes all the way down. And through studying the Tonalamat and some of the history there, it's certain things that come out. So just mention it to y'all with the Tonalamat is fully a codification of many of our cultures' spiritual knowledge.
Thank you for that. Any final remarks? All right. Thank you so
Go
much.
back to that. Hey, yeah, another plug, Nipmuc Language. So if you guys want to donate anything, go to NIDC, Nipmuc Indian Development Corporation, and reach out to Shauna Carter, P.O. Box 60127, Worcester, Massachusetts. She's also one of the commissioners for the Massachusetts Indian Commission for Indian Affairs. So you can reach out to her through that too if you want.
Thank you both so much. Can we have another round of applause for our panelists?